Welcome back to the Meeple Marathon and our continued coverage of tiny epic dungeons. Today we're going to be talking about how to set up and play the game. And then in our next video we will be doing a full playthrough of the game using the Potions and Perils expansion and the Stories expansion. So, big epic game, we'll see how it goes. This game is quite tough, especially with 2 players. So, can't make any promises how successful we'll be, but setup is pretty straightforward, especially if you have access to the game mat. The game mat pretty much just gives you a place for everything. Same thing with the hero mats, and you basically just place your stacks of cards on the designated locations. But if you are, don't have the mat or still are confused, let's go through basically everything that you need to do. So there are basically going to be in the base game 4 stacks of cards over here to the left of your dungeon area. Now it's important that you leave space in the middle if you don't have the mat to create a 7x7 grid. So you can see how big that is, but your dungeon can extend 3 cards this way and 3 cards this way and 3 cards towards you. Usually people have plenty of room above them, but just make sure you're sticking the stair card, which always starts in the middle with your heroes on it, kind of in the middle of that area. And then you're basically just going to stack these for the Goblin deck, the Minion deck, the Loot deck, and the Spell deck. You're going to shuffle them up and stick them either off to the side or on their appropriate icons on the game mat. If you are playing with the Potions and Perils expansion, you're going to do the same thing for the potions stack. So basically everything just has a spot. You shuffle them up, you place them down. Next, you're going to want to take your torch mat, which is, they refer to torch mat as this large oversized card here. And you want to make sure you start with it on Act 1. So this is going to be tracking when the enemies activate and what your timer is for the dungeon phase. Act 2, which is on the other side, is for when you have found the boss and entered the boss's lair and are now attacking the boss. So you want to set this down, make sure you're on Act 1 side, and then put the torch based on the player count. So 4 players would start up here, 3 and 2. This is one of the difficulties of just playing with 2 players, is you literally have less of a timer to get to the boss. This moves down at the end of every hero's turn, not round, but every hero's turn, this knocks down. And personally, if you just run into bad luck revealing the rooms and don't find the minions, which help you push this torch back up and give you access to the boss's lair, then you easily just run out of time. I realize that they push this up because you yourself are getting less actions per torch movement in a 4-player game, but those other players are also opening, revealing rooms, discovering new areas of the dungeon. So I've seen a lot of people discussing, as far as the torch mat is concerned, if you are playing 2 players, that they only move the torch after both heroes have had a turn. So at the end of, say, a round, then you would move the torch and activate it. At the end of the day, it's your game. Play however you like. If you feel like the game is too difficult, why wouldn't you just implement that simple rule? And it could very well be that Goblin Games will come out with an errata here and make it an official way to make the game easier. They have ways to make the game harder, but not easier. So that's my little spiel. So basically you want to put this somewhere within easy reach. Again, if you have the game mat, it is very clear where you're going to place this torch mat and place the torch on it. If you don't have the game mat, you also want to go ahead and take these tokens and kind of place them around the outside of the torch mat like this. Okay? But since we have the game mat, we're going to place them on their spots like so, because there is no miniature for the goblins, and there's not even a unique meeple for the goblins. When a goblin comes out, you're going to put its card here in the lowest numbered empty space, and you're going to take that representative meeple. For example, this is the 4. You would start with the 1, and you're going to place it onto the card. This now represents the goblin in the dungeon, but all of his stats are going to be back over here. The same thing happens with minions, and it there's basically a number of minions in the game equal to the number of players, and you have to defeat them in order to gain access to the boss. Minions have their own unique Meeple. So when a minion is discovered, you search for the Meeple in your box and you put it out. But again, it's just a little Meeple that's represented running around the board. The card is going to sit over here and allows you to track its health. And then once it's knocked down, you can discard it, flip it over, whatever it may be. So again, if you are playing without the mat, you want to make sure you wouldn't put this torch mat so close to where your dungeon area is. You would want to give it a little space so you have space to put the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, and the 4s while you're playing, because as this goblin comes out, you would place it right here, and you know that this one is the number 1 goblin. So if I defeat this little Meeple, I have defeated this number 1 goblin. And then the minion would go to the right of your torch mat. Nothing's over here. Okay? So we've gotten the torch mat down. We've gotten all of our decks of cards. If you are playing with the Stories expansion, there is a spot over here for the Stories, aka the objectives that are added to your quest of finding the minions, defeating the minions, and getting to the boss to defeat the boss. These are just side quests, essentially, but you have to defeat them in order to gain access to the boss. So this is where your story card is going to be, and depending on how many story quests you add to the game, 1 or 2, you're going to have a number of tokens also out for because once you find that objective, a lot of them are like pick up and deliver type quests, so you're going to need something to represent what you're carrying. All right, so we have kind of covered all of what comes on the game mat. The last 2 things is, depending on the number of minions you're playing with, you're going to want a number of gray hearts. All right, these are different from the red hearts that are going to come on your player board. These are going to track your minions' health. So again, a number of hearts per player. So we're playing a solo game, but a solo game has to be a 2-handed game, so it's essentially a 2-player game. And you can see in a 1 and 2-player game, we have to fill up 2 of these slots with hearts before we can unlock the door to the boss's lair. Again, if you're playing 3, there's 3 hearts. So you want to have these off to the side. These are going to be placed on the minion card when it's flipped over. And you're also going to want a number of these equal to the number of minions. Okay, these are like, portals. There's always going to be one in the entrance space. And then after the minions are flipped over and defeated, you're going to place these on their spaces as well. And this is going to come into the boss battle. Okay, so just keep that in mind. You're going to have a number of hearts equal to the number of minions, and a number of these portal tokens equal to a number of minions, and that number is equal to your player count. So very straightforward. All right, last but not least is your stack of boss cards here. Now, if you are playing the, if it's your first game, they recommend you find, where is he? And then we'll just reshuffle these. They recommend you play with the dragon cards. You would want to go find the dragon card specifically, and then put him face down over here. Now, all of the backs of all the boss cards look identical to this, so you can easily, like I'm doing now, shuffle up this deck and then randomly draw one, let's say this one, and put it over here. So you don't know which monster, which boss you are fighting at the end of the day. I'm going to keep the dragon out here just for a minute so we can talk later about how to control the boss. Okay. All right, so we've got all of our cards out. We've got our boss card mat out, our torch mat out. Now we need to get our dungeon room deck built. This is probably the most confusing part of setup, but if you have the rule book in front of you, it's very straightforward. So what you're going to do is you're going to have a stack of all of your regular encounter cards. Okay, these are going to have this symbol right here in the upper left hand corner. Some of them might have the Stories expansion symbol on them, but that's okay. All right, so you're going to want to have that stack of cards shuffled. All right, you're going to want to have your minion encounters. These all look exactly the same, but they have the little minion symbol in the corner. Those separate. And then your boss layer entrance card. So that's going to have the boss symbol on it. Also, if you are playing with the Potions and Perils expansion, you want to make sure you set aside the lab. I forget what his name is, Misty's Lab or something like that. You want to make sure the lab card is set aside. It's got the Potions and Perils symbol in its corner. And for a story game, and I forgot to do this, you want to make sure that you have the specific card that is relevant to the story set aside as well. So I need to actually search back through here and find the one with the people chained up. All right, there you go. So we've got our two specific cards necessary for the Potions expansion and necessary for the Potions expansion. Now, depending on the story you choose, this card is going to change. Some of them are cards that are included in the story's expansion. Some of them are from the base game. You just need to make sure you find that card and set it off to the side. Okay. So, what you're going to do now is create 3 stacks of cards. So I'm going to flip these over to make shuffling easier. Again, you're only going to have 2 minion layers per player, so the other 2 can go back in the box in a 2-player game. And then you've got this stack of cards. So these are kind of like the standard encounters, the boss layer, and the minion encounters. You're going to take 3 cards from this deck, from the standard deck, and place them on top of the boss card. So you know that the boss entrance is always going to be within the bottom 4 cards. Then on this one, you've set aside 1 minion card per player. Then you're going to take 3 regular cards per player. So in a 2-player game, that's 6. Okay, set those off to the side. And then last but not least, you're going to take, depending on the player count, a certain number of cards left off to the side. So in a 2-player game, that just happens to be 9. The numbers are all in the rule books. I don't have them memorized, but that's going to leave you some, under most circumstances, back in the box. Okay, now, normally you would shuffle up this pile, place this on top of this on top of this, and that would create your stack. That means you're going to have, some cards at the beginning which are going to just allow you to explore. You're only going to be running into goblins. It's going to give you a chance to build up your character before entering, finding minions who are more difficult. And then you know that the end of the stack is going to have the boss layer in it. But before we do that, as part of setup, and each story card has the, this setup instructions in it, but it's all very simple. It's basically saying taking this card and shuffling it into the top half of this middle deck. So before we do that, I'm going to shuffle up this deck to make sure the minion cards get shuffled up in there. All right, so I know that this deck has 8 cards in it. So I'm going to 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to get 4 off the top, and I'm going to add this card to it and shuffle it in. I'm also going to do the same thing for the Potions and Perils expansion. Okay? So anytime you have a room that is part of an objective or a specific room part of an expansion, you shuffle it into the top half of this kind of middle deck, deck B. That way you know that you still have a, 9 or so cards to get your feet out in front of you, get your feet wet, but then you also know that your objective card is not going to be at the bottom of the stack. So that's going to go over there. Then the last thing you're going to do is take the top 4 cards and give yourself 4 paths to take. Because you can see that this room has 4 ways to exit it, and so each one of these is an option of a path we can take. Okay? And that is it for the game board. Essentially, remember, we set this guy off to the side because in our Rescue Adventurers quest, once we find the jail cell, the prison room, these guys will then become the adventurers that we have to rescue. These represent the adventurers in this story. All right, so this stays there until we uncover that card. Then this goes onto the board, and we have to help them get to the entrance, basically. Over here, very straightforward. You're essentially going to pick your hero mats and place them out. If you have the hero boards, it's very obvious where you want to put them. You're going to find the matching miniatures, place them on the entrance card, and you're going to get yourself a focus token and a health token and put them on the top spaces of each one here. Similar to creating your space for your dungeon to grow, you also want to make sure you have space below and to the right side of your hero card, because your armor cards, your clothing cards, are always going to be stacked here on the right, and any hand cards, so loot cards that require you to have them in your hand, are going to cover up these two abilities here on the bottom. They're going to give you new abilities, but for example, if you gain a sword, you're going to drop your bow staff. Essentially, you're going to cover up your bow staff with that new sword. So you need to make sure you have room underneath here and to the side to place those cards. These cards can kind of go anywhere. So your trinkets, your jewelry type stuff, your pendants and magical items, those can go anywhere, as well as your spells and your potions. They can just kind of go anywhere around your hero. You basically get 2 of everything except for armor. You can only have 1 armor. But that's it. Again, if you have the hero mats, it makes it very straightforward and makes certain that you have room to set those up. Last but not least, you want to make sure you have your 3 hero dice as well as your 1 red enemy die. Some people may have extras of these, so each person playing could have their own set of dice, but you really just need, this is all you need, 3 dice plus the enemy die. This is the most amount of die you're ever going to be able to roll on a given turn to handle a skill check or heroic action spell, something like that. But that's it for setup, ladies and gentlemen. Ooh, one last thing is there is a set of disarm tokens that you want to just have off to the side somewhere. So I have mine in a little bowl. Basically, as you're traveling through the dungeon, you're going to come across lots of traps. You have to do a skill check to see whether or not you can get past the trap, but you also will have the option to stop and disarm the trap, which means anybody else, including yourself, that passes through that room again will not have to deal with the trap. Basically, these are nice flat tokens that you don't really affect being able to put miniatures on the card as well. So that's why those are there just off to the side for when we need them. Okay, that is going to do it for setup. Now let's take a closer look at everything and we'll explain how to actually play the game. So a turn in Tiny Epic Dungeons consists of 2 phases. The first is the hero phase, where you get to take your actions as a hero, move around the dungeon, take heroic actions, battle goblins, take free actions, cast spells, things like that. And then there is kind of the enemy phase, or the dungeon phase, in which you have to move the torch down this track. So you can see that this track has kind of a sloping look to it, and as the torch moves down, various things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen in the dungeon. You can see there are a few blank spaces as well, so sometimes there is no effect for moving the torch down, but at the end of every hero's turn you need to move the torch down, so just keep that in mind. But let's talk about what you have the ability to do on your turn as a hero. You can do 3 things, and you can do these in any order, and those 3 things are move, you can perform 1 heroic action, and then you can do any number of free actions. So you can move once, you can perform 1 free or 1 heroic action, and then any number of free actions. And you can do those in any order. So you can choose to smack a goblin that's in the room with you when you start, and then move, or you can move, finish your movement in a room with a goblin, then smack it around. But there's lots of other things you can do with your 1 heroic action. But let's start with movement first. So movement is basically going to be based upon your movement value, which is that boot symbol, the number next to it. So for Clotho here, it is 4. So Clotho here, when she wants to move, she basically, especially at the beginning of the game, picks a direction, and for a movement point, she can explore a room. So it doesn't cost an action, doesn't cost a heroic action to explore a room. It simply costs a movement point to open the door and move into that room. So let's just flip this over here, and we can see there's several things on this card that we're going to talk about here in a second. But the first is that you'll notice this one actually has 4 paths leading to and from it. So this is a pretty straightforward one. What you have to do when you flip it over is make sure that one of the paths, and there's always at least one path going into a room, connects with the room that you are leaving. So in this case, we can leave the card facing up as normal and then move into this room. Well, let's just say, for example, this was the card we flipped over. You'll notice that there is only a right and a left room. So I could not lay this card down like this. It would have to, again, which is nice and straightforward, lay down like that. Let's see if we can find one here that breaks the rules, or not breaks the rules, but makes us turn it a little bit. Okay, so here's another one. Now this one we have a choice. We could lay it down like this. There's a connection here, and then that means we can explore down this way, or I could lay it down like this. There's still a connection to the room I'm leaving, but the new room to explore would go up. All right, well, let's just turn it like this just for right now. And then last but not least, I thought for a second there we were going to unlock all Goblin rooms. This one has four places to leave from, so we can put that down anyway. So once you have explored a room, no matter what happens, you then will place rooms at the openings of all of the hallways. So let's just go back to this being the first room that we explored. We explored this room. All right, we know there's going to be a goblin in here. We put the card down so that there is a pathway for us to connect to, and then we've laid rooms around it so that everywhere that we can explore now has a room card assigned to it. We don't know what it is, but it's there. Now, this room, which has the goblin symbol on it, the big plus with the goblin face on it, means that we have found a goblin. We've walked in on them. They have caught us by surprise, so that's what this symbol is. This symbol at the bottom here means that when you flip this card over and you enter this space, you have to take 1 damage. So we would just take 1 damage for being surprised by the goblin. You have to enter a room when you explore it. If you are using your movement to explore a room, you have to enter that room. You cannot flip this card over and say, ooh, there's a goblin in there, I don't want to go in there. You have to consider it that your movement was walking through that door. That's how you got to figure out what was in the room. There are actions or spells you can do that allow you to flip cards over without moving into it. We'll get into those a little later. But just know for now that as you're moving around, you have to move into rooms as you reveal them. So in this case, we would go ahead and draw the top goblin card from the deck. We can go ahead and flip it over, and then I'm going to put this in the number 1 goblin slot on my mat. Or if you don't have the mat, you would put it right here above the 1 slot on the torch mat. Either way, you're going to take the 1 goblin meeple, place it in the dungeon that now represents the goblin you have to defeat. So normally, if you don't come across goblins, you can continue to explore. Even if you come across traps or other rooms, you can bypass the trap, either pass the skill check to bypass it without any damage, or take the damage. Either way, you can keep moving. Anytime you walk into a room, anytime you enter a room with a enemy, a goblin in this case, you have to stop your movement. You cannot continue. You cannot leave him behind. So in this case, we would have to stop. All right, but let's just see if we can't find some examples here. This is another bad example because it's another goblin card. All right, so here's one. And let's see, maybe this one. No, that's another one as well. So many goblin cards at the beginning. Okay, so here's some better examples. Let's just say this is where we want to just start from, and we say, all right, I'm going to take 1 movement, I'm going to explore this room. Okay, I need to twist it so it matches, then I can move into this room. At this point, I would have to resolve this trap. We're going to get back to that. We're just talking about movement right now. I also would have placed a room out here connected to the path. once I deal with the trap, I can then continue my movement. I haven't walked into a room with an enemy, so I can continue. This was 1 movement. This would now be 2 movement. Okay? Even though you see enemies pictured on here, there's not the symbol of the goblin. So this is not actually walking into a room with an enemy. So we would walk in here. We'd have to deal with the room trap, which in this case is kind of sneaking past these sleeping goblins. But either way, there is now a room here at the end. We put one here. We've got more movement. We can actually move 4. We've only moved twice. So we're going to take our 3rd movement here and we find this card. Okay. Now, at this point, we've gone 1, 2, 3 down from the center. And I'm also, you can't really see it, but I'm at the edge of my game mat. So when I put new room tiles out, I can only go here and here. I cannot continue down because I've reached the edge, the invisible edge of the dungeon. Either way, I can move in here, and then I can explore here. And at this point now, I have reached the end of my movement. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now this whole way down, I was having to deal with a lot of these traps. This room actually doesn't have a trap. Traps do not stop your movement. Only goblins do. So that's basically movement in a nutshell. You can continue moving up to your movement value as long as you don't walk into a room with an enemy. As soon as you enter into a room with an enemy, you stop your movement. Now, if you start in a room with an enemy, if you started in this room, say you walked into this room last round, you chose not to defeat him, you chose to take a different heroic action other than, attacking him, you could then spend your next movement to move, or your next turn to move away from the enemy out of the room because you started in that room with the enemy. All right, so that's movement. Movement's very straightforward. Now let's talk about heroic actions. So in doing so, let's take a closer look at our hero card here. Heroic actions are always going to be in this kind of blue, honestly, they look like a tombstone to me. Some people call them a coffin. But the blue symbols always represent heroic actions you can take. So everybody always has heroic actions on their card. So for Clotho here, she has an attack action, a melee attack action, in which she uses strength. You can see here her strength is not very good. And that's to make a melee attack. Or her Psychic Blast uses a spell. All right, it's going to use Intellect, which is very good. And she has to pass a skill check and then spend a certain amount of focus, and then she can do 1 damage. So anytime you see a blue icon, this one is search. So you can search this room as a heroic action. This one here that had the trap on it, the spiderweb trap, you can spend a heroic action to disarm this trap. Now, heroic actions are going to stop your movement, just like goblins do. So you need to decide, are you going to do your heroic action first, or are you going to do your heroic action after your movement? You cannot interrupt a movement, do a heroic action, and then continue your movement. So basically, anytime you see a blue symbol on a card, that's a heroic action you can take, or you've always got heroic actions that you can take on your card, including everyone's always got a rest action. So it's not very heroic, but this is considered a heroic action, which means you can only rest on that turn. That's basically the only thing you're doing, and you can only rest once per turn. All right, so as you're moving around the dungeon, then once you're done moving, you then decide what heroic action you want to take. Now, in this first example where I ended up in a room with a goblin, there's a very good chance I would want to take either the melee damage or my spell action to attack the goblin. That way he doesn't attack me back during certain phases of the dungeon phase here, the enemy phase on the torch mat. That's usually what you would do, but again, you don't have to. When you attack an enemy, they're going to possibly counterattack you. And so there's a chance you could take damage. You may be, way down here at like 1 health and no focus. And you may say, well, even though I ran into a room with a goblin, I'm going to heal and take my rest action. As my heroic action, I'm not going to attack. So again, those are options. You don't have to attack if you are in the room with an enemy. Then, on top of the heroic actions are the free actions. So these are going to be with the yellow star. All right, and you can take as many of these as you want as long as you can pay for them. So in this instance, on top of my heroic action, at any point in time, I could spend 4 focus to gain a spell from either the spell deck or the spell discard pile. All right. Here, for example, this one allows me to take a free action to do an intellect skill check. I have to hit a 4 or better on my skill check. If I'm successful, I can then spend 3 focus to gain max health back. However, if I miss, I lose 2 hearts. All right, let's look at another one. This one, for example, when you walked into this room, instead of taking a heroic action to attack it, you could take a free action to spend 4 focus to instantly kill a goblin in your room. This would allow you to get rid of the goblin and, say, rest or do something else with your heroic action. So anytime you see the orange star icon, that's a free action, and you can take any number of those you would like, including on the torch mat itself. You can see here that there's a free action. In this case, you have to move the torch down 1 space, but in doing so, you can flip over up to 4 cards 1 space away from you. So, for example, here you could flip over this one, or if you did this at the very beginning of the game, you could flip over all 4 rooms to see which direction you want to go. But if you did that at the beginning of the game, you might have 4 goblins all of a sudden on the mat. So that is free actions. And having 4 goblins, while we're on the subject of having 4 goblins on the map, let's talk about what the win-loss conditions are for the game. To win, you have to make your way through the dungeon, find all of the minions, defeat those minions, which will then give you the key to the boss's lair. You have to then go to the boss's lair and defeat the boss. That is how you are successful. That's Act 1 and Act 2. You can break them up if you so choose. There are 3 ways to lose the game. One of which is if there are 4 goblins. You'll notice there's only 4 goblin meeples. If there's 4 goblins already out in the dungeon and you are asked to place a 5th goblin, you are overrun and you lose the game. Okay? So you can't just let the goblins hang out and run away from them all the time. You're going to have to address them, because if you ever are asked to place a 5th goblin out onto the board, you lose. Now, once you defeat number 1 here, he's going to go back. His card's going to go into a discard pile, and then the next goblin that comes out will just also be number 1. So it's not like you're only going to see 4 goblins. You'll see way more than that. You just don't want to see 4 out all at the same time. Or if the torch makes it all the way down here to the skull at the end of the track, you have taken too long and you are lost in the dungeon. You lose. Okay, and remember, this torch moves after every single hero's turn. Not every round, but every single hero's turn. There are ways to push it back up, but just keep in mind it moves after every turn. And the last one is that there are some times when either you're running into the edge of the map or you run into dead-end cards, for example. There are a few cards that don't have a new way to go. There are instances where you could explore the dungeon and not be able to find all the minions, or not be able to lay down the boss lair entrance card. It's a crappy way to lose the game, but you've technically lost the game. That is similar to running out of time. You have gotten lost in the dungeon and cannot complete your mission at that point. You haven't perished, but you also haven't won. So those are the 3 loss conditions. All right, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's come back to our hero turns. So, when you are taking a heroic action and or a skill check, in some cases, for example, this free action takes a skill check. Most heroic actions take a skill check. Okay, So you're taking one heroic action per turn, any number of free actions. Most of them are going to require skill checks. So let's take a look at those. Anytime you see, one of these symbols here, which are your statistics, so your strength, your agility, and your intellect here, with an arrow next to it, that means you have to use that skill and pass that number for your skill check. So we have to pass an intellect 5 skill check in order to do Psychic Blast, in order to even be able to charge it up, and then we have to pay for it by spending 2 focus to do this much damage. All right. Or, for example, here, when you enter this room, you can immediately attempt to sneak past them, so you're having to do an agility check and beat an agility check of 4. If you were Clotho, you'd have 2 dice to roll for that. For Clotho's Psychic Blast, she can roll 3 dice for that. All right. So that is kind of how you read the symbols. For example, this one here, this free action to get rid of a goblin doesn't require you to pass a skill check. It just requires you to pay the 4 focus. Okay. When you are completing a skill check, that's when these dice come in. All right, we're just going to focus on the black dice for right now. Now, like I mentioned a second ago, when you complete a skill check, you look to see which trait you are testing. In this case, we'll do Clotho's Psychic Blast. She has a level 3 intellect, so we get to roll all 3 dice. You can never roll more than 3, and you can never roll less than 1. So even if for some reason your stat would be reduced to 0, you still get to roll 1 die. In this case, we're going to roll all 3, and we go ahead and roll them out. All right. Now this was not a very good roll. I'll tell you why. Some high numbers, but we don't always want high numbers in this game. Because what you have to do at this point is choose 1 die, a single die. Even though I rolled 3, you have to choose a single die to be your base. All right. In this instance, we would probably choose 4. All right. It's closest to 5. It's a nice, good, sturdy base. But with 4 does not get us to 5. We are not passing the skill check of 5 in this case. But we've got our base. What we need to add to the base are sides of the die with the plus sign on them, which is only a 1 and a 2. So you're actually, when you're rolling dice, hoping to get a mixture of high numbers and low numbers. It's an interesting take on the whole dice mechanic. So this would give us 6. Even adding this would give us 7. All right, but let's go back to the way they were here a second ago. So say this is the dice that we rolled. All is not lost. Everybody, every hero on their playmat has a free action which says spend 2 focus to increase or decrease a die of your choosing. So we could spend 2 focus. Let's bring this back. We'd spend 2 focus to go 1, 2. And we could either turn this directly into a 5. All right. Or we could take this 3 and knock it down to a 2, which means we can now add them together to get 6. It's entirely up to you. And you can do that since it's a free action. You can do that as many times as you want, as long as you have the focus to pay for it. Okay. So you could manipulate a dice twice down or twice up if you wanted to, or 2 different dice, as long as you had 4 focus to spend. Now, after you rolled your dice, and then after you have spent focus to manipulate them, if you so choose, and you might end up with a trinket or a spell or something like that that can manipulate your dice, maybe some armor or something like that. But once you are done manipulating your dice and you have picked your base and you've picked your modifiers, anything left over, any die that you did not need or didn't have to spend to beat your skill check, you gain the symbols on the bottom. So in this case, we would gain 1 focus back. All right, you have to spend the focus first to manipulate the dice, but then at the end, you're going to get this focus back. Okay, and this all happens, gaining this back happens before you spend the focus to complete the spell. All right, so all of the dice stuff happens, you know, rolling them, manipulating them, gaining in that order from them. Then we continue the spell. In this case, we would spend 2, 1, 2, and we'd get to do 1 instant damage to anything up to 1 space away. All things, and technically that's what this symbol means. This symbol right here means 1 space, up to 1 space away, all goblins. Testing intellect, skill test 5. If successful, spend 2 focus to hit everybody for 1 heart. And goblins only need 1 hit. So this is a great tactic to take if you're surrounded by goblins. Do a psychic blast, and everybody that's in a room, either in your room or in a room next to you, you are taking them out. So that is how you complete a heroic action, a skill check. Anytime that you need to complete a skill check to complete any type of action, those are the steps that you're going to take. So I'm going to read you from Michael Coe directly on BGG. What he is stating is the order of operations for any type of skill check. So you're going to select the skill to check. In this case, we'll call it a spell. All right. So you're going to select the spell to cast. You're going to select its target. You're going to roll for the skill check. You're going to roll the dice based upon your trait value. So in this case, it was 3. Okay. If there's an enemy in the room, you have to roll enemy die. We'll get back to that here in a second. All right. Once you've rolled the dice, then you modify, if desired, paying focus as needed. Okay. Then you will determine the dice you want to use and the dice that will be unused. So in this case, we are using these 2. This was the unused dice. If your results meet the difficulty of the skill check or higher, you are successful and you proceed. At this point, you gain focus or health from unused dice. Yes, there is a health on the 6 side. So if you roll a 6 but happen to not need it, you can actually gain a health back instead of focus. At this point, then, you then pay for the spell, or, you know, you have to, spells you have to pay for, other things like melee attacks you don't have to pay for. So this is now extra steps for spells. You have to pay for the spell. If you don't have enough focus at this point, the whole spell has failed. All right, so if for some reason I was up here at 3, and I rolled these dice and I had to spend 2 to manipulate it, and I got down to 1, I would then not have the 2 energy I needed to fire off the spell. So the whole spell would have failed. All right, but let's assume that we did pass. We did have enough to spend. We deal the damage as necessary, and then if the target survives, that's when we deal with the counterattack die. So those are official words from Michael Coe. There is an FAQ up on BGG. I highly recommend you check that out. It's a living document, so they're constantly updating it right now with everybody's questions, and there are a lot. So we've talked about, you know, the skill checks. We've talked about the difference between heroic actions and free actions. At this point, there is a lot of symbols on the board, on all the cards, on all the hero mats, on all the dungeon tiles. There is no way to remember all this your first couple plays, maybe not ever, or B, there's no time for me to sit here and go through every single symbol and explain to you what that symbol does. So my suggestion to you is, if available, find you the card appendix that they have created here. It's a 14-page document where they explain to you what every single what every single action on a hero mat does, what every single card does, spell, item, loot, potion, you name it. Also, however, on the back of the rule book, it folds out. All right, so it can be like 2 pages, is this huge icon guide as well. So pretty much this gets you, I'd say, 75% of the way there of playing the game and knowing how to play properly. The rest of the 25%, you'll probably need to look up specifics about a specific card in something like the appendix. So I'm not going to go through all the symbology now. We're just going to talk about dealing, attacking. So we talked about firing off a spell, right? You fire off a spell, you do an instant point of damage for a goblin. That is all you need. Done. Well, let's say, however, you need to do a ranged spell called a missile attack and or a melee attack, in this case her dagger, and you're doing it against, we're just going to say a goblin. So you only need to hit the goblin once, but unlike magic, you're going to have to get through his defenses. So here is Pokey the Goblin here. He's got a movement of 3, but you can see he has a shield of 6. All right. In order to hit him with a melee or missile attack, we have to complete a skill check using our trait of choice. In her case, strength for a melee would be very weak. She's not going to be doing a lot of melee attacks, but let's just say she has 3 dice there, or 3 cubes next to her melee. To do a melee attack, to do her dagger attack, she could roll 3 dice. Now, in this instance, to kill Pokey the Goblin, we actually need this 6, and we need this +1. This 5 is extra, but there's no symbol on it to do anything with it. All right, but this would kill Pokey the Goblin, okay? Because we have reached his shield level, and then we've gone at least 1 over. The same thing is for the bosses, except the bosses have way more than 1 health you need to defeat them. Same with the minions. The minions have a shield level you have to reach, and then anything beyond that is damage that they take, and you're going to track their little heart down. But for Pokey the Goblin here, you just have to hit him once. In this case, you've hit him once with this. He's going to be knocked out. He can't counterattack. Nothing else like that. But anytime you are attacking, and this includes ranged attacks, missile attacks, this also includes spells, as long as the person you're attacking has line of sight on you, you're going to roll this enemy die. This is the counter attack die. All right. So in this instance, we would roll all 3. And see here, we've got some bad news, because at this instance, picking 1 as our base, all right, is only halfway to 6, and we can't add these to it because they don't have a plus sign. We'd have to spend 4 focus to flip these both down, and now I'm at a 7. Now I'm hitting Pokey the Goblin, okay, and he would die. But coming back here to our original roll, we actually missed him. We didn't get past his defenses, so he's going to counter. So what does he do? You take the base number from his counter attack die, all right, and then you're going to add his attack modifier here, which is right here. All right, so this says it is +1 times the number of goblins out on the board for all 3 types of attacks. Pretty basic. All the goblins are the same. The more goblins out on the board, the higher their counterattacks. You would take, and this, if he's the only one out right now, he is a 1 plus 3 is a 4. We look up at Clotho. Clotho has herself has a defense of 4, so the Pokey's counterattack also misses. All right, but that's how you go about all of your attacks. Is you're rolling your dice, you're trying to meet and then exceed as much as possible for minions and bosses the shield number of who you're attacking, using the same skill check rules. And then if you don't kill the enemy, you look at the counterattack base plus any modifiers on the card. There are 2 other symbols on here that you need to pay attention to. So this one here is the shield breaker symbol. If this is rolled and you miss, and Pokey the Goblin, or if you hit a minion and you don't kill the minion, the value of the die is exactly equal to whatever your defense is. So in this case, it would be 4. So this becomes a 4. This basically means that the die is meeting your defense, and so whatever their counterattack modifier is going to get through. This one, however, means that Pokey the Goblin completely whiffs but in doing so, for some reason, it pushes the torch even further down. All right, and if this pushes this down to activate enemies or add goblins to the board, you need to do that at that point. So really, the best die face you could get is 2 or like a 3 nice low numbers. You really don't want to see these 2 pictures on the enemy die. But that's how an attack action works for melee and ranged attacks. And as long as you can reach Pokey the Goblin with your ranged attack and he can see you, he will counter back if possible. All right. If you are lucky enough to defeat Pokey the Goblin, that's where you're looking for this blue symbol. Kind of looks like the Goblin Knight. And this symbol here says, all right, you've killed the Goblin. What do you get? You get to draw a loot card, and you get to flip over a dungeon tile card for free. All right, so this is one of the instances where you could flip over this card and say, ooh, there's going to be a Goblin in here, but I didn't have to walk in. Okay, I told you there was going to be those. And I was right. Okay, so that's how you make an attack against a Goblin. It's the same for both ranged and melee. Melee usually uses your strength stat, and ranged usually uses your agility stat. But it depends on the weapon you're using. Clotho here right now cannot make a ranged attack because she doesn't have anything. She has a dagger to make a melee attack, and she's got her spell, but that's it. Now, coming back to Clotho here specifically, her dagger would be desperate. If she, basically the only reason she would use her dagger is if she knew she wasn't going to have enough focus to spend on the spell. Because here, she's only rolling 1 die. All right. And then on top of that, that die result is going to have to be subtracted by 1 because she's not very strong. All right. Melee attacks are not her thing. So this 1 actually would be 2 would become a 1, and she's way past Pokey the Goblin. Technically, there's no way she could defeat Pokey the Goblin because at best, with a single die, she could roll a 6, but then she'd have to reduce it by 1, and that's below his level. All right? Sometimes those are plus modifiers, which make things a lot nicer. So let's talk about, we talked about us attacking them and them counterattacking. Let's talk about when the enemy attacks. So first we're going to take a look at the torch mat here. And we're going to notice there's 2 symbols here on the torch mat that we're going to pass over, and they're going to do bad things. The first one is this symbol of the goblin face with the stairs symbol. All right, this means the goblins are being called by their minions and their bosses, and they're coming in from the outside world, and so they come in at the stairs. So anytime your torch reaches this symbol, you can see it's going to happen several times throughout the game. You draw the top goblin, you place it either next to your torch mat or on the mat, space on the mat if you have the game mat, and you add the meeple to the board. All right. This symbol is for when enemies attack. So unless your torch is moving and landing on this symbol, the goblins and the minions in the room don't attack. Now they'll poke you for 1 when you walk into their room and they surprise you, and they'll counterattack you, but they won't actually attack you until instructed to do so on the torch mat. Same thing with minions. You could actually sit in, you could bring out a minion and the torch could be right here, and it would move here, here, and then here before the minions would ever even attack you. But when the minions do attack you, you're going to look here to see there's that matching symbol. In this case, Pokey is either going to move, or 1 space away, he will hit anybody 1 space away. He's got a really long spear, I guess. All heroes 1 space away, he can do 1 damage to times the number of goblins. Remember, goblins kind of get stronger the more goblins there are in the layer. Let's take a look at some of the minions here and what they would do. All right, so this dungeon crawler here would get to move, and then it would attack all heroes with 1 space away. It's going to hit him for 2 health and take away 2 focus. Okay, remember the slash means or. You either move or attack. So if there's nobody in range to attack, he would move. But even if he then moves into range, he's already done his one action. Whereas the dungeon crawler here has a plus sign, so they can move and attack. Let's see what the next one is. All right, so the dire serpent is going to move, and then it's going to attack only in its space where it ends. Okay, that's what this symbol means. In its current space, 3 damage. Okay, and this also, it's only going to be one person. You can only attack one person because it doesn't have the multiple heads symbol there. All right, and this last one here is going to move. Then it's also going to be allowed to attack one person for -2, and then it's going to gain 2 health back. That's what that gray heart is. Remember, the gray hearts are used to track their health. And you can see that the minions are also pretty nasty. For example, their counterattack here is for a ranged or spell attack is +3 to that modifier. They also are going to gain 2 shield for that one attack. So the minions definitely get harder compared to the goblins. But that is how you attack them. That is how they attack you. And remember, they only activate an attack when this symbol, when the torch hits these symbols, the red square or diamond, the red diamond with the eyeballs inside. Okay, so let me just go through my notes here. We've talked about heroic actions, we've talked about attacking, we've talked about spells, we've talked about damaging and killing enemies, we took the torch mat, and that's pretty much it. The last thing that we just need to talk about here is how you gain loot and spells. So let's go over to our hero mat. Okay, so here we have our hero mat set up, and we're going to talk about loot and spells and things like that as we add them. But first, let's just look at the 2 ways you can earn loot or spells as a reward. So the first one is where the 2 symbols are colored in. You can see that right here. They're nice and bright. This is an ore, so here you get to draw 1 loot or draw 1 spell. That means you can either draw the top card from the pile, or you can take any 1 card from the discard pile, so you would know exactly what you're getting. However, if the symbol looks like this, where it's kind of grayed out, and there's going to be ones where you would see that the spell is grayed out. Anytime it's grayed out with the green arrow, that means it has to come from the discard pile. So there are just several ways. Those are the 2 different ways you can earn a loot. All right, so let's take a look at our loot here. There's a few things that you need to pay attention to. One is the symbol up here. This is a trinket. This is something you have to hold in your hand, not necessarily a weapon. Here's another thing you have to hold in your hand. Here's another trinket. All right, more trinkets, more hand. So here's an actual weapon that you would hold in your hand. Here is some armor. Okay, so depending on what you unlock, armor goes up here. All right, one hand would say go up here. But if I do this, if I take this sun hammer, I no longer have access to my bow staff, okay, because I'm covering it up. I could put it here and lose my inner focus and keep my bow staff and my sun hammer. All right, but it's my choice, but I have to cover something up. Trinkets could say go down here like this, and then spells and potions are going to go over here. All right. If you come across something later on, say you really want Eyes of the Viper instead, you can at any time when you're gaining loot, discard loot, not take it or discard it, and that's how things end up in the discard pile for people to pick up based on that specific action. But you can only ever have 2 trinkets, 2 hand items, 2 spells, 2 potions, and 1 armor. Okay? So, and you can see here that these all have various actions, like this armor is going to give you +1 movement and allows you to, what I believe is move through walls. The sun hammer allows you to take a melee action using strength, but you add 1 to the die. You can also, during your melee action, spend, or you gain 1 focus with the Sun Hammer. This one has a free action. You can spend 3 focus to flip over any card. So you can see how gaining loot and items drastically improves your hero and makes the game easier. There's also legendary sets of items. So if you're familiar with Role Player, this will be very similar. Should be very common for you. So you'll notice that these 3 items all have this bear symbol in the lower left corner, and they are all something of the bear, something of the bear, something of the bear. So these are all part of a set. All right. So as you collect these, say near the end of the game, this is what your hero looks like. All right. They basically have a near completed set of the legendary bear armor. They've got the studded jerkin, the great axe, and the war horn. All of these have their individual things that they can do, but since you have a set or a portion of the set, they're going to get you extra benefits when you take certain actions. For example, the bear, and these all say the same thing at the bottom, but the bear set, when taking a melee action, gets you +1 to your roll, +2 to your roll, or +3 to your roll, depending on how many pieces of armor. So in this case, I have 3 pieces of this set. I get +2 to my melee attack roll. Let's look back at some of these here that we've already looked at. For example, here is the Scarab set, so Orbs of the Scarab. When taking a melee action, I'm going to, the more things of the Scarab I have, the more kind of temporary defense I give myself. Or the Vipers here. The Vipers, the more I have of the Viper set, for enemies in my same space, I can take additional hearts away from them, depending on how much Viper set I have. So those are all that I have right in front of me. Let's see if I can find any other. No, that's more Scarab, more Viper. And not everything is part of a legendary set. Like, for example, the Cursed Dragon Scale looks cool, but you can see it's not part of a set. So, and you can have 2 different types of sets. You can have this loadout. So you can have a portion of, where's my thing here? So you could have your 2 trinkets and your 2 hands worth. So you've got 3 items of the Great Bear and 2 items of the Viper. You're going to get those benefits depending. In this case, you're going to get -1 additional hits. And in this case, you're going to get +2 to your melee attack rolls. So collecting sets is a bonus. So if you're playing with other people and they come across part of your set, they may consider not taking the loot, discarding it immediately, so that you can pick it up later. All right, spells are going to work very similar. All right, there's no sets for spells, but basically there's 2 slots for spells. You're going to put them there, and you can see they all give you something. They all have a cost and a skill check you have to pass. Some of them, the question mark means you can use any skill, whereas this one you have to use intellect skill. But as we said before, you basically complete your skill check. If you pass, then you pay the cost and you do what it says. Again, lots of symbology, no way to memorize it. Have your appendices handy. And then the last thing is the potions. Okay, so this is only if you have the deluxe set. This is the Potions and Perils expansion, because the potions are going to give you kind of one-time use things. You can see it's a free action to drink this potion, and then you're going to get +3 movement and +5 to an agility skill check for haste draw. But anytime you gain a potion, you have to deal with the peril first. So at the top of every potion is this pink exclamation mark. That is a peril you have to deal with when you gain the potion, not when you drink it, when you gain it. After that, the peril is not in effect, and you simply have the potion to drink at any point in time. You can carry up to 2. But that's the potions and perils point, is that every potion comes with a cost, and that's the peril that sits on top. Again, there's a lot of symbology, but the instructions for the mini expansion explain all that. Okay, so that is basically how all of the loot and spells work in the game and how you collect them and how you add them to your hero mat. Okay, the last thing we need to talk about is the boss battles. This is technically Act 2. So this is after we have made our way through the dungeon, we have defeated a number of minions equal to our player count, and we have found the bosses, the entrance to the boss lair, which we know is going to be in those bottom 4 cards. Once we have accomplished all those tasks, we can then enter the boss's lair. We will, flip over this card, and now we have the actual lair. You're also going to want to flip your torch mat from Act 1 to Act 2 and reset your torch, wherever my torch went, it's over here, again to up here. So you now have a whole new amount of turns to defeat the boss. So don't worry, even if you are on this space of the torch mat and you enter the boss's lair, you are not going to lose the next turn. You still have this many turns to defeat the boss. But there's a lot less chances to move the torch back up, so you don't have forever. Okay, so once you flip this over, a couple things have to happen. First of all, every place there was a minion space, like this one for example, remember these tokens that you set off to the side at the beginning of the game? These are now going to go on the minion spaces. And there was always one here at the entrance space too. So those are going to be important, and we'll tell you why in just a second. You're also going to take the hearts that you used to track the minion health and then to unlock the door, and you're going to stack them up on the end here. So in a 2-player game, this dragon has 16 health that we need to knock off him to defeat him. In a 3-player game, it would be 24 health, and in a 4-player game, it would be 32 health. So you can see how the level of the dragon, the boss, scales with the player count. Okay, and then really what you want to do is enter into the boss's lair here and attack the boss. It's going to counter and attack you back, but you're hoping to reduce its health to both hearts to 0, and you win the game. Pretty simple, right? But the hearts cannot go past this mark here until you have done a ritual on the boss, which means you have to take them to a ritual site. Now, the boss can leave the boss's lair to do that. All right, and that's why you have these. So in just the core game, all the bosses are represented by this one token here. Right now he's in the lair, but as he moves out of the lair, he can use this token to move around the dungeon. Or if you have the boss Meeple upgrade, this would be your Meeple for the dragon. All right. So in order, you could be in his lair and defeating him, hitting him, but then at some point your hearts are going to go there and not be able to go any further. At this point, you're going to have to draw the boss out of the dungeon and take him to one of these 2 spaces. It doesn't matter whichever one's closer or whichever path benefits you more, but you have to get the boss here, and as soon as they are in a space with one of these tokens, you can pick up that token, place it on the board, and now your hearts can pass that line. And some bosses have more than one of these spots on them, so that makes them more difficult. You got to erase them multiple places around the dungeon. Once they're out of the boss's lair and in the dungeon, you can still attack them like normal. You could also then run back into their lair and draw them back into the lair. At this point, you would move the Meeple back. Once it goes in here, it kind of like disappears, and now he's right here again. Okay, so think about it that way. So that is A, why you had these tokens. B, why you put them out there, but how you actually defeat the boss. Now, let's take a closer look at the boss card here so we can see a few things. When this particular boss is moving, it can move 3 spaces at a time. All right, so it's got a movement value. Also, it's got a shield of 8. So if you're doing a melee or ranged attack against this dragon, you need to get to at least 8, and then everything over 8 is going to be damage that he takes. All right, or if you're doing a spell, That's basically just direct damage. It bypasses this 8 shield. Okay? These right here are its attack modifiers. So if you do a melee attack against it, again, you're going to have to roll the enemy die. So you're going to roll it like this. And in this case, you would add 3 plus 4. So he's hitting you for 7 in a counterattack. In a ranged missile attack, he would attack you hit you back for 6. And in a spell attack, you actually have to spend 2 in order to even do a spell attack against him. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's how that reads. All right, there's a few other things on this map. I don't know why, I don't know why I put it down. Okay, also, all bosses have an action that they take when you roll this symbol. So not only do you have to move the torch down on the mat 1 space, but you also have to do this. In this instance, everybody 1 space away from him is going to take 2 damage. This is when on the torch mat, the boss activates. So the torch may be here and moving here, and then when it gets to here, the boss, along with any goblins in the dungeon, are all going to activate. In this instance, he's going to move unless there's already somebody in his room, and anybody 4 spaces away is going to get hit for 2. Now, if they are in the boss's, if the boss is in the boss's lair, nothing goes beyond that. Yes, there is a door to this lair, but this is like its own separate space. Okay, but then once he comes out, even into the entrance, then it's 4 spaces away from here. Okay, so think of this as like a separate space. Think of this as like a portal to the boss's lair. So as long as there is a hero here, the boss isn't going to move and is only going to attack people in here. So you could have a hero who's lighter on health running around taking out the goblins or something like that. Okay, so bosses have their attack action, bosses have their counter attack modifiers, as well as the torch die modifier. And then there are also these spaces around the outside that you can see have the, whoops, sorry about that, have the kind of hero helm symbol on them. These are the spaces that you can stand as the hero. All right, so when you enter the dungeon, you have to have a point of movement to go from the entrance into the boss's lair. Well, this is Clotho here. We know Clotho has a movement of 4, so say she ended her last turn here, and now this is the start of her new turn. So she's got 1 point of movement. You always look for the black arrows. See how there's 2 black arrows? This is where you come into the boss's lair. At this point, she could go, that was 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way over here, or she could go this direction, or she could have just barely made it into the dungeon, and this is as far as she can go. Now, each of these spaces is going to grant you something. Sometimes it's an immediate effect, sometimes it's a negative effect, sometimes it's a bonus effect for taking an action. These 2 spaces, you're going to lose a certain number of hearts for stopping there. Here you're going to gain focus for stopping here. These 2 spaces, you are going to gain +2 to a strength test. This one you're going to get +2 to a agility test. And here, the furthest into the dungeon you can get, think of this as like coming around behind him where he can't see you. See, he's facing this way. You've made it, you took the time to come all the way deep into his lair. Any skill is a +3. Okay? But the only time you gain these benefits is if the boss is in the lair. And remember, you're going to have to at least once get the boss to leave its lair and go out. But that's why it may be beneficial to draw it out, put this token on it, and then draw them back in. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. They are going to continue to counter you when you attack them, make it difficult on you. You have to draw them out and complete the ritual, and then once you do, once all the hearts have reached 0, then you are successful. But keep in mind that this torch mat is going to continue to put goblins out into the dungeon, and then they're going to move towards, even if both of you are in here, goblins are going to move towards the dungeon, towards the boss's lair, and then eventually into the boss's lair. So if this guy has 1 point of movement, he then moves into here, and he's now in the lair as well. He will attack you, and you can attack him. All right. So if you just squatted in here the whole time, the goblins eventually could make it in here. And if the game asks you to draw a 5th one, you would lose the game because there's 4 out. Okay. Technically, being knocked out of the game does not end the game for you. Even if both heroes are knocked out at the same time, it is not game over. You simply both just have to heal or rest the next turn. That is your heroic action you take, and then you can move. So you basically rest and then you run away. But even if you are fighting the boss and both of you are knocked down, that is not game over. It's only until the torch track makes it to the skull or 5 goblins are needed on the table. But that is going to do it. I really have only scratched the surface of what this game is capable of. This is not a very lightweight game. There is a lot of strategy to it. There's a lot of depth to it. It's very straightforward from, on paper, but there's a lot of symbology to remember, stuff like that. So have those printouts handy, have those appendices handy, check up on the FAQs as much as you can. I believe I have covered the basics at this point. I know this has been a very long video, but it was kind of a long rule book, and I wanted to make sure we covered everything as best we could and explained some of the confusing parts. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, please consider subscribing to the channel. Once again, thanks for watching. Have a great day.